Anthropologists traditionally live with and become fully immersed in the societies that they study in order to get a comprehensive and holistic understanding of all facets of social life. The method that sets anthropology apart from other disciplines is ethnography, the qualitative process of exploring in depth the whys and hows of human culture, behavior, and expression. After I read with interest the way of life of anthropologists, my cognitive appetite for culture was activated. As a result of this action, I contextualize in search of culture, which has become a scholarly, intellectual, analytical conversation. In this conversation, I have mirrored the way of life of an archaeologist as an author, cinematographer, media arts major, licensed cultural practitioner, and publisher to get the cultural evidence. In getting this cultural evidence, I began digging through the layers of built-up information and material to try to understand the processes through which the layers were built up over time, and to find any critiques and exposés buried within the said layers which seemingly accentuates human behavior. Importantly, the said behavior determines culture, and culture determines behavior across time and space, is verbalized in podcast 113, captured in 13 chapters and framed in ISBN 978 976 9665026. In this induction, it should be noted that various cultures use a different interpretation of the way of life of anthropologists. Archaeology looks at the remains of past cultures to try to understand the behaviors and beliefs of ancient people. Archaeologists piece together how behaviors and beliefs have changed over time and how they've affected the modern cultures we live in. Biological anthropologists are concerned with exploring how humans vary biologically, how humans adapt to their changing environments, and how humans have evolved over time and continue to evolve today. Linguistic anthropology is the anthropological subfield that focuses on language and its importance to understanding human history, culture, and biology. It is also part of what makes us human. Linguistic anthropologists study language and how language is used in order to understand culture. Linguistic anthropologists are interested in how many languages there are, how those languages are distributed across the world, and their contemporary and historical relationships. Linguistic anthropologists are also interested in language variation, why variations exist, how the variations are used, and what they mean when they are used in various contexts. The more that I drilled down in this topic, it helped me develop analytical tools for interpretation, reading, and understanding, and a wide range of cultural practices and forms, past and present, especially in relation to the way of life of the disciplines of anthropologists, archaeologists, biological anthropologists, social cultural anthropologists, and linguistic anthropologists. Now that I have reached a certain level, at this juncture, I have unearthed the fact that this topic certainly is no myth, but an unquestionable dialogue and a doctrine that evolves and involves what, when, where, why, and how. Evidently, this way of life of practitioners has created and will continue creating an intellectual environment for inquiry. The more that I pursue this research, my intellectual cognitive appetite was increasing as I fleshed out the way of life of anthropologists, archaeologists, biological anthropologists, social cultural anthropologists, and linguistic anthropologists. This close-up view of these practitioners' way of life provided explicit detail to the extent that it drew my attention to human behavior. In my mind, there is no doubt that in this space, human determines culture and culture determines behavior across time and space. To put it succinctly, now that I have provided some context, grammatically speaking, in search of is an idiomatic phrase equivalent to searching for. These idiomatic phrases mean the same thing, especially when applied in the space of anthropologists, archaeologists, biological anthropologists, sociocultural anthropologists, and linguistic anthropologists. Likewise, social cultural anthropology and archaeology are practically identical in their purposes. At this juncture, since I have explained in detail this topic in search of culture in previous paragraphs, I have decided to further compare and contrast this ethos against the background of these practitioners' way of life, using my analytical lens as an author, cinematographer, media art specialist, licensed cultural practitioner, and publisher. It is because I have assembled data about these practitioners that now I have been enlightened to rethink my relation to history, because it made visible the position of cultural practitioners' way of life, created a cultural framework for evaluation, unearthed the fact that culture is constantly changing, observe a set of practices that are in dialogue with the past, taken note of how culture has been registered through texts, images, buildings, documents, stories, and myths, why people do what they do, say, believe, and think the way they do. In search of culture is a doctrine that crossed the boundaries between the disciplines of anthropologists, archaeologists, biological anthropologists, sociocultural anthropologists, and linguistic anthropologists' way of life, and between formal and informal cultural activities. Additionally, the fact that an ethnographer or cultural anthropologist tries to get information from many angles to see whole picture, again, striving for that holistic view is indicative of the fact that this method validates my premise in search of culture. This approach facilitated the process in developing an analytical environment for reading and understanding a wide range of cultural practices and forms, past and present. What is uniquely interesting is that although these practitioners' way of life cannot be categorized as a myth, yet they are influenced in some ways by the idiomatic expression in search of culture becoming an unquestionable assertion. The practitioner's way of life and this idiomatic expression are seemingly inextricably linked with a set of teachings that evolve and continues to evolve in the context what, when, where, and how. From my perspective as licensed cultural practitioner, the application and the employment of the lens aided me in becoming well informed with what I considered as a way of life of anthropologists, archaeologists, biological anthropologists, sociocultural anthropologists, and linguistic anthropologists. Notably, if in search of as an idiomatic phrase is applied correctly, then it amplifies the message in ways which can get global citizens' attention and awaken our senses to accurately determine the veracity of this premise. Moreover, the data I collated about these practitioners, combined with the phrase in search of culture, confirms culture as a word for the way of life of groups of people, meaning the way they do things. Ostensibly, as a practitioner, I concur that in all probability, the same legitimizes this argument. All things being equal, I hasten to state that in search of culture has the capacity to reconcile any global citizen who do not recognize themselves as part of an emergent sustainable world community or does not recognize their actions as supporting the values and practices of their community, implies that practitioners are part of this idiomatic phrase in search of culture is a narrative. Overall, in search of culture is deemed a scholarly, analytical, intellectual conversation, which I ensued as an author, cinematographer, media arts major, licensed cultural practitioner, and publisher. In navigating this process, I mirrored the way of life of an archaeologist in order to get at the cultural evidence. In this process, I used my research skills as a vehicle, which included my lens to dig through the layers of built-up information and material to try to understand the processes through which the layers were built up over time and to find any critiques and exposés buried within the layers. This conversation helped me develop analytical tools for interpretation, reading and understanding a wide range of cultural practices and forms, past and present. For me, it certainly is no myth, but an unquestionable dialogue and a doctrine that evolves and involves what, when, where, and how at the same time the way of life of practitioners, thus creating an intellectual environment for inquiry. This exposition creates space for the self-determination theory because of the fundamental psychological needs which must be fulfilled for well-being and growth. The same is a theory that underpins this discourse, while the approach of rapport-based communication is critical. At the end of the day, when the proverbial dust is settled, in search of culture implies and implicates these practitioners because it is their way of life which is deemed culture, but also imputes human behavior which determines culture, and culture determines behavior across time and space. Importantly, In Search of Culture is a cultural conversation which is verbalized in podcast 113, captured in 13 chapters, and framed in ISBN 978 976 9665026.